Roseville, Michigan, was a picture of suburban tranquility, where neatly trimmed lawns and white picket fences masked the chaos lurking behind closed doors. On June 14, 2017, Laura Harrison's modest home at the end of Maple Drive was no different. The morning air was crisp, the hum of distant lawnmowers blending into the chirping of sparrows. But for Laura, this morning was anything but ordinary. A plain cardboard box rested on her doorstep, unassuming yet out of place. Its edges were worn, the tape barely holding it together, as if the contents had struggled to escape. Laura's brow furrowed as she bent down, her hands trembling slightly. The box had no return address, no sender. A wave of unease rippled through her as she carried it into the kitchen. The house was eerily quiet. It hadn't always been this way. The laughter of her two sons, Michael and Kevin, had once filled these walls. Now, their absence echoed like a haunting melody. Laura set the box on the counter, her instinct screaming at her to stop, but a darker curiosity pulled her forward. She grabbed a knife from the drawer and sliced through the brittle tape. The smell hit her first, a faint, metallic tang that turned her stomach. Her hands froze. Slowly, she peeled back the flaps, each movement deliberate, as if delaying the inevitable might change its reality. Then she saw them. Two heads stared back at her, their lifeless eyes wide open, as if frozen in the terror of their final moments. Michael's face bore a faint bruise on his cheek, while Kevin's lips were parted, as though he had tried to speak even in death. Laura staggered back, the room spinning. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps as bile rose in her throat. Her vision blurred, but a folded piece of paper tucked between her sons' severed heads forced her to focus. She reached for it with unsteady hands, her fingers brushing against Kevin's dark hair. The paper unfolded easily, the words scrawled in sharp, jagged letters. "You made your choice. Iron vultures." Laura's knees buckled as the weight of the message hit her like a freight train. Her sons, her reason for everything, were gone. She collapsed onto the cold tile floor, clutching the letter to her chest, her sobs silent and raw. A scream clawed its way up her throat, but it never escaped. Instead, a quiet, searing rage settled in her chest, igniting something primal and unrelenting. For a moment, time stood still. The morning light streaming through the window seemed cruel, indifferent to the carnage laid bare on her kitchen counter. Laura wiped her tears with the back of her hand and pushed herself to her feet. Her eyes, once filled with despair, now glinted with something far more dangerous, resolve. She walked back to the box, her movements mechanical. This wasn't the end, she realized. It couldn't be. The iron vultures thought they had broken her, but they had no idea what they'd unleashed. They had taken her boys, the only family she had left. Now, she would take everything from them. In that moment, Laura Harrison transformed. The suburban housewife was gone, replaced by a woman forged in pain and vengeance. The Queen of Detroit had been reborn, and her reign of terror was about to begin. Before the chaos, there had been peace. Laura Harrison's life had once been the kind of quiet existence that others might envy. Her days were a steady rhythm of grocery shopping, folding laundry, and preparing dinner in her small but cozy home on Maple Drive. Her husband, Mark Harrison, was the backbone of their family, a tireless mechanic with grease-stained hands and an unshakable dedication to his wife and two sons, Michael and Kevin. Michael, at 16, was the responsible one. He had inherited Mark's work ethic and often helped his dad tinker with old cars in their garage. Kevin, 2 years younger, was the dreamer, full of mischief and endless questions about the world. Their house, though modest, had been filled with laughter, warmth, and the comforting certainty that, no matter what, they had each other. But the winter of 2015 shattered that certainty. It was a bitterly cold night in January when the knock came at the door. Laura had been in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, while Michael and Kevin played a video game in the living room. The officer on the porch looked uncomfortable, his hat clutched in his hands. His words came in fragments that didn't immediately register. "Mark, accident, robbery gone wrong, we're sorry." Laura's knees gave out as the weight of his words sank in. Mark was dead. Shot twice in the chest during what the police called a random robbery outside the repair shop where he worked. But as the days passed, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The vague condolences from Mark's co-workers and the way certain officers avoided her questions only deepened her suspicions. Her suspicions became certainty when she found the stash. It was 2 weeks after Mark's funeral. The boys were asleep, and the house felt unbearably quiet. Laura wandered into the garage, seeking some trace of Mark, something that would make him feel less gone. That's when she noticed the loose floorboard under the workbench. Beneath it was a small metal box containing a wad of cash, a burner phone, and a bag of marijuana. Her breath caught. Mark had been dealing drugs. At first, the discovery felt like a betrayal. Mark, the man who had sworn to keep their family safe, had been tangled up in something dangerous. But then the anger gave way to a grim realization: Mark had been trying to fix their financial troubles. The repair shop barely paid enough to cover their bills, and the medical debt from Kevin's asthma treatments had been piling up. He had taken a risk, a deadly one. Now, Laura was left to pick up the pieces. The bills continued to pour in, and the life insurance payout was a cruel joke, barely enough to cover the mortgage for a few months. Creditors began calling, their voices cold and relentless. One night, after putting the boys to bed, Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of unpaid bills. Desperation gripped her like a vice. Her gaze drifted to the small metal box sitting on the counter. It was the last remnant of Mark's secret life, a life that had gotten him killed. Her stomach churned at the thought of using it. But what choice did she have? The grocery store job barely covered groceries, let alone the mortgage. The boys needed clothes. They needed heat in the winter. They needed a home. Laura made the decision that would change everything. At first, it was small. She sold the marijuana to a few neighbors she trusted, people who knew her situation and didn't judge. They paid in cash, and for the first time in months, Laura felt a glimmer of hope. But hope came with a price. As word spread, more people began knocking on her door. The small sales turned into steady income. Steady income turned into a lifeline. But as the months passed, the guilt grew. Laura told herself it was temporary, just until she got back on her feet. She hid everything from Michael and Kevin, locking the stash away behind a loose brick in the garage. She couldn't let them know. She couldn't bear the thought of her sons seeing her as anything other than the mother they loved. Yet, with every transaction, Laura felt a shift, a small, almost imperceptible change in who she was. The desperate widow was being replaced by someone sharper, harder, more willing to take risks. For now, she was still Laura Harrison, the grieving wife and devoted mother. But deep down, she knew she was walking a line she might never come back from. And somewhere in the shadows, the world that had taken Mark was waiting for her. Laura Harrison hadn't intended to stay in the drug trade. At first, it was a means to an end, a desperate act to keep her family afloat. But the lure of easy money and a fleeting sense of control began to erode the moral boundaries she had once held so tightly. What started as small, discreet sales to trusted neighbors quickly spiraled into something larger, something far more dangerous. By the summer of 2015, Laura had established a modest but consistent stream of customers. Word spread that the quiet widow on Maple Drive had good stuff, and strangers began showing up at her door. She had no experience with this world and had to learn quickly. Mistakes could cost her everything. But Laura was smart. She watched, listened, and adapted, developing a business sense she hadn't known she possessed. Her garage became her operation center. She carefully measured, packaged, and stored the product behind a loose brick in the wall. Every interaction was calculated, she never let her guard down, always keeping the transactions quick and impersonal. But even as the money started rolling in, Laura knew she was walking a razor's edge. The tension in the house grew with each passing week. She kept her activities hidden from Michael and Kevin, but secrecy came at a cost. She stayed up late, jittery and paranoid, unable to sleep. The boys noticed her exhaustion, the way she flinched when the phone rang, or how she seemed to jump at the sound of footsteps outside. One night, Michael confronted her. "You're always tired, Mom. You're always nervous. What's going on?" he asked, his voice a mix of concern and frustration. Laura froze, her mind racing for an excuse. "It's just work. Things are hard, but I'm handling it," she said, forcing a reassuring smile. But Michael wasn't convinced. He lingered in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her with a gaze far too knowing for a 16-year-old. While Michael grew increasingly suspicious, Kevin was oblivious, or so Laura thought. In truth, Kevin had been paying closer attention than she realized. The 14-year-old had stumbled across her stash one afternoon while searching for his soccer cleats in the garage. Instead of confronting her, he stayed silent, curious about what his mother was up to. By the fall of 2015, Laura's small-time operation was no longer enough. The bills were paid, but the financial strain lingered, and the temptation of more money proved too strong. She began making connections with local suppliers, men who sold in bulk and were willing to deal with her despite her inexperience. They saw potential in the seemingly harmless widow, someone who could operate under the radar. Laura's business grew, and with it, her confidence. But growth brought new risks. Strangers loitered near her house, and her once quiet neighborhood began to feel hostile. The local police cruised by more frequently, their presence a constant reminder of how precarious her situation was. Yet, Laura couldn't stop. The money gave her a sense of control, a power she had never felt before. For the first time since Mark's death, she wasn't afraid, she was in charge. Then came the day everything changed. Kevin finally confronted her, holding a small bag of marijuana he had taken from her stash. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Why didn't you tell us?" Laura's heart sank. She opened her mouth to deny it, to lie, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat Kevin down and explained. She told him about the bills, the debt, the desperation that had driven her to this. To her surprise, Kevin didn't react with anger or fear. He nodded, as if he understood. "We can help," he said, his eyes shining with determination. Laura recoiled. "No. Absolutely not," she snapped. "This isn't your burden. You're my son's, not my partner's." But Kevin was persistent. Over the next few weeks, he wore her down, convincing her that he and Michael could help make deliveries, keeping her out of sight and minimizing risk. Michael, however, was furious when he learned of the plan. He refused to have any part in it, calling it reckless and dangerous. The argument that followed was explosive, driving a wedge between mother and son. Despite Michael's disapproval, Laura let Kevin join her operation. The thrill of the business excited him, and his youthful boldness brought an energy Laura hadn't anticipated. Together, they established new routes, delivering product across the city and avoiding detection by following strict rules Laura put in place. By the end of 2015, Laura was no longer the grieving widow struggling to make ends meet. She had become something entirely different. She was a player in a dangerous game, a woman who had traded her innocence for survival. But as her network expanded, so too did the dangers surrounding her. The shadows she had stepped into now loomed larger, threatening to consume her and everything she held dear. And deep down, Laura knew, there was no way out. By 2016, Laura Harrison was no longer just a desperate widow scraping by, she was the Queen of Detroit. Her transformation from a grieving housewife to a calculated leader in the city's drug trade was both remarkable and chilling. Her operation had expanded far beyond the quiet streets of Roseville. Laura now controlled a network of suppliers, runners, and distributors, with her influence spreading across Detroit and into nearby towns. The name Laura Harrison was seldom spoken aloud in the criminal underworld. Instead, she was referred to in hushed tones as the Queen, a title that carried both reverence and fear. To her allies, she was a brilliant strategist who knew how to navigate the dangerous waters of illegal trade. To her enemies, she was a ruthless competitor who had no qualms about taking out anyone who stood in her way. But power came with a price, and Laura began paying it in ways she hadn't anticipated. Laura's rise to power wasn't just due to her intelligence, it was also her ability to leverage relationships with powerful people. She had built an alliance with William "Bill" Carter, a city councilman with a clean public image but a dirty appetite for drugs and money. Bill provided her with protection, ensuring that police raids conveniently missed her operations. Her other ally, Richard "Rick" Baxter, a wealthy businessman, helped her launder her earnings through his construction companies. He saw Laura as a valuable partner, someone who could generate profits while keeping his hands clean. But perhaps her most significant connection was with Officer Carter, a cop who walked a delicate line between law enforcement and corruption. He tipped her off about rival dealers and ensured her deliveries stayed off the radar. These connections solidified Laura's position at the top, but they also fed her growing paranoia. She knew that loyalty in this world was fickle, and trust could be a fatal mistake. She began keeping detailed records of every deal, every bribe, and every betrayal, a meticulous ledger of the empire she had built. While Laura's empire grew, her home life began to crumble. Kevin, now 15, was fully immersed in her operation, running deliveries and negotiating deals like a seasoned professional. The thrill of the business had transformed him into someone unrecognizable, bold, sharp, and dangerously cocky. Laura tried to shield him from the darker aspects of her trade, but Kevin's growing ambition often led him into risky territory. Michael, on the other hand, wanted nothing to do with his mother's empire. He watched in dismay as Kevin embraced the lifestyle, becoming a shadow of the boy he had once been. The tension between Michael and Laura reached a boiling point one night when he confronted her in the kitchen. "This isn't who we are, Mom," Michael said, his voice trembling with anger. "You're supposed to protect us, not drag us into this mess." Laura's response was cold, almost mechanical. "Everything I've done for you and Kevin. If you can't see that, then maybe you don't understand what it means to survive." Michael's eyes filled with tears, but he refused to back down. "Surviving isn't worth losing who we are. You've turned Kevin into one of them. You've turned yourself into one of them." The argument ended with Michael storming out, leaving Laura to wrestle with a growing sense of guilt. For all her power and success, she couldn't escape the feeling that she was losing the very family she had fought so hard to protect. Laura's rise didn't go unnoticed. The Iron Vultures, Detroit's most notorious gang, had controlled the city's drug trade for years. They saw Laura's growing influence as a direct threat to their dominance. At first, they sent subtle warnings, delays in shipments, stolen product, and veiled threats delivered by intermediaries. But Laura wasn't one to be intimidated. She doubled down, securing more suppliers and expanding her security team. The Iron Vultures escalated their attacks. By early 2017, her runners were being ambushed on the streets, and whispers of a full-scale turf war began to circulate. Laura held her ground, determined not to show weakness. But the Vultures weren't her only problem. Within her own ranks, cracks began to form. Some of her lieutenants grew resentful of Kevin's rising role in the operation, questioning why a teenager was trusted with major responsibilities. Others began to question Laura's leadership, whispering about her reliance on powerful allies like Officer Carter and Bill Carter. The final blow came in March 2017, when Laura discovered that Officer Carter had been feeding information to the Iron Vultures in exchange for money and protection. Her most trusted ally had betrayed her, leaving her vulnerable at the worst possible time. The betrayal sent shockwaves through her operation, and for the first time, Laura's control began to slip. That same month, the Iron Vultures made their boldest move yet, targeting one of Laura's main distribution hubs. The attack was swift and brutal, leaving several of her men dead and her product stolen. It was a message: the Queen's reign was coming to an end. By the spring of 2017, Laura found herself at a crossroads. Her empire was crumbling, her family was fractured, and her enemies were closing in. But even as the walls closed around her, Laura refused to back down. She had clawed her way to the top, and she wasn't about to let anyone take it away without a fight. Yet, deep down, Laura knew the truth. The power she had sought to protect her family had become the very thing tearing it apart. Her ambition had blinded her to the cost, and now, the price was coming due. The Queen of Detroit was still standing, but her crown was slipping. And in the shadows, the Iron Vultures were waiting for their moment to strike. By June 2017, the cracks in Laura Harrison's empire had turned into gaping fissures. Her once flawless network was splintering under the relentless attacks of the Iron Vultures, and her most trusted allies had become liabilities. She had fought to protect her family, to keep them safe from a world that had already claimed her husband. But now, the very empire she had built for her sons was threatening to destroy them. It began with a phone call. Laura was in the kitchen late at night, the glow of a single bulb casting shadows across the room. The number was unknown, but something in her gut told her to answer. The voice on the other end was cold and detached. "We have your boys," the man said simply. Her blood ran cold. "Michael and Kevin," she whispered, gripping the counter for support. "They're alive. For now. But if you want them to stay that way, you'll hand over your entire operation. Everything: suppliers, contacts, territory. You have 48 hours. The line went dead before she could respond. Laura's hands trembled as she dropped the phone onto the counter. Her mind raced, imagining her sons in the hands of the Iron Vultures. She knew their reputation: merciless, calculating, and unrelenting. If she didn't comply, they would follow through on their threat. But giving up her operation meant more than losing her empire. It meant exposing her allies, burning the bridges she had carefully built, and leaving herself vulnerable to retaliation. For the first time in years, Laura felt helpless. The next morning, she ordered her team to stand down, warning them not to engage with the Iron Vultures under any circumstances. "No one moves until I say so," she barked, her voice shaking with uncharacteristic uncertainty. But Michael and Kevin, defiant as ever, had other plans. They had overheard parts of the phone call and pieced together the rest. Despite Laura's insistence that they stay out of the business, they saw the situation as their chance to prove themselves. Kevin, eager to demonstrate his loyalty to his mother, convinced Michael to join him on a mission to retrieve the product stolen by the Vultures. "It's just one run," Kevin argued. "We'll get the stash back, and she won't have to give up anything." Michael hesitated. "This is insane, Kevin. You're gambling with our lives." "She gambles with hers every day," Kevin shot back. "We owe her this." Reluctantly, Michael agreed, and the brothers set off, slipping out of the house under the cover of darkness. The Iron Vultures had been watching. They knew Laura's sons were her Achilles heel, the one thing that could bring her to her knees. As Michael and Kevin approached a quiet street near the docks, 3 SUVs pulled up, blocking their path. The ambush was swift and brutal. Masked men descended on the brothers, overwhelming them before they had a chance to fight back. Michael shouted, struggling against the ropes binding his wrists, but Kevin remained eerily calm, his defiance shining through even in the face of danger. They were dragged into the back of one of the SUVs and driven to an abandoned warehouse. The cold, damp air clung to their skin as they were thrown onto the concrete floor. The gang leader, a towering figure with a scar running down his cheek, knelt in front of Kevin. "You think you're smart, kid," he sneered. "Your mother thought the same thing. Look where it got her." Kevin met his gaze, unflinching. "She'll come for us," he said. "You'll regret this." The leader laughed, a low, menacing sound. "No, kid. She'll come for you. And then she'll fall." The next morning, a delivery arrived at Laura's doorstep. It was a plain cardboard box, much like the one she had received years ago when her husband's belongings were returned to her after his death. Her hands trembled as she carried it inside, setting it on the kitchen table. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. But she did. Slowly, methodically, she peeled back the tape and lifted the lid. Two severed heads stared back at her, Michael and Kevin, their lifeless eyes frozen in a silent scream. A single note lay tucked between them, its message simple and devastating. "You made your choice. Iron vultures." Laura collapsed to the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. For the first time in years, she screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed through the empty house. Her boys were gone, taken from her in the most brutal way imaginable. The walls of her empire, built so carefully over the years, came crashing down around her. But in the depths of her grief, something else began to stir, rage. The iron vultures thought they had broken her, but they had only ignited a fire that would consume everything in its path. Laura rose to her feet, her tears drying on her cheeks. She stared at the box one last time before turning away. Her hands were steady now, her mind clear. They had taken everything from her. Now, she would do the same to them. The Queen of Detroit wasn't finished yet. And the iron vultures were about to learn the true cost of crossing Laura Harrison. Laura Harrison sat alone in her dimly lit kitchen, the box that had shattered her world still on the table. Her sons, Michael and Kevin, were gone, taken from her in the most brutal, calculated act of vengeance. The grief was suffocating, a black hole pulling her into its depths. But grief soon gave way to something else. Rage. A fire ignited within her, burning away any hesitation, any fear. The iron vultures had taken everything, and now they would pay. That night, Laura summoned the remnants of her once loyal crew. Her empire had been battered by the relentless attacks of the iron vultures, and many of her former allies had either fled or turned against her. But a handful remained, men and women who had been with her since the beginning, who still believed in her. They gathered in her garage, the air thick with tension. Laura stood before them, her voice cold and commanding. "They think they've won," she began, her gaze sweeping over the group. "They think they've broken me. But they've underestimated what a mother can do when she has nothing left to lose." She laid out her plan, a coordinated attack on the iron vultures' key operations. Their drug warehouses, their safe houses, their money laundering fronts, nothing would be spared. She had spent years gathering intel on her rivals, and now she would use it to dismantle them piece by piece. "This isn't about survival anymore," Laura said, her voice steady. "This is about making them feel the same pain they've caused us. They wanted war. We'll give them hell." In the early hours of June 17, 2017, Laura and her crew struck. The first target was a warehouse near the docks, a major distribution hub for the iron vultures. Under the cover of darkness, her team infiltrated the building, planting incendiary devices among the stacks of drugs and cash. The explosion lit up the night sky, a fiery beacon that sent a clear message: the Queen was still standing. The attacks continued over the next 48 hours. Safe houses were raided, shipments were intercepted, and stash houses were torched. Each strike was precise, calculated, and devastating. Laura's knowledge of the vultures' operations gave her the upper hand, allowing her to stay one step ahead of their retaliation. But the cost of her vengeance was steep. Her crew suffered casualties, and each attack brought them closer to exposure. The police, already wary of the escalating violence, began closing in. Laura knew the clock was ticking, but she refused to stop. She had nothing left to lose, and she wouldn't rest until the iron vultures were ashes. Amidst the chaos, Laura discovered a deeper betrayal, one that cut even deeper than the loss of her sons. Her investigation into the Iron Vulture's movements uncovered evidence that Officer Carter, her longtime ally, had been working with the gang. He had been feeding them information about her operations, allowing them to strike with deadly precision. Confronting him was both a risk and a necessity. Laura cornered Carter in a dingy bar on the outskirts of the city, her presence drawing wary glances from the patrons. She sat across from him, her eyes blazing with fury. "You sold us out," she said, her voice low but venomous. "You handed my boys to them." Carter's facade of calm cracked. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he muttered, his gaze darting around the room. "I was just trying to keep myself alive." "Alive?" Laura leaned closer, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "They're dead. My sons are dead because of you." Before Carter could respond, Laura's crew emerged from the shadows, dragging him out into the alley. The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the night, marking the end of his betrayal. With Carter gone and the Iron Vultures reeling from her attacks, Laura prepared for the inevitable. She knew the Vultures wouldn't let her actions go unanswered. On June 19, 2017, they launched a full-scale assault on one of her last remaining strongholds, a safe house in the heart of Detroit. The battle was fierce, a chaotic clash of gunfire and explosions that left the streets littered with debris and bodies. Laura fought alongside her crew, her determination unyielding despite the overwhelming odds. But as the night wore on, it became clear that they couldn't hold out much longer. By dawn, the safe house was surrounded by police, drawn by reports of the violence. Laura stood in the wreckage of her empire, her once loyal crew either dead or captured. She knew there was no escape, but she refused to give the Iron Vultures the satisfaction of taking her alive. As the police breached the building, Laura stepped forward, her hands raised in surrender. The Queen of Detroit had fallen, but she had taken her enemies down with her. Laura was arrested on June 20, 2017, her reign as the Queen of Detroit brought to an end. But her legacy of destruction would linger. The Iron Vultures, though weakened, had survived, and the city was left to grapple with the aftermath of a war that had spilled into its streets. As Laura was led away in handcuffs, she allowed herself one final glance at the chaos she had wrought. The fire of vengeance that had consumed her had also destroyed everything she had fought to protect. And yet, in her heart, she knew she would do it all over again. Because vengeance, for Laura, was the only thing worth living for. And the price she had paid, her family, her freedom, her soul, was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The courtroom buzzed with tension on January 8, 2018, as Laura Harrison was led inside. Shackled and flanked by armed guards, she walked with a composure that unnerved everyone present. Her sharp gaze swept across the packed room, pausing briefly on the rows of journalists scribbling feverishly in their notebooks. Her name had become synonymous with violence, destruction, and power, and now, the public was eager to witness the downfall of the Queen of Detroit. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Over the course of 2 weeks, they painted a damning picture of Laura's criminal empire. Witnesses testified about her rise from small-time dealer to one of the most feared figures in Detroit's underworld. Former allies, now turned state witnesses, described in detail the bribes, the intimidation tactics, and the elaborate network she had built to distribute drugs across the city. The most shocking evidence, however, came from Laura's own meticulous records. Investigators had recovered a series of notebooks from her home, each filled with detailed accounts of her operations, transactions, names, addresses, and dates. The ledgers left no room for doubt about her role as the mastermind behind the operation. She wasn't just involved, the prosecutor declared, pacing in front of the jury. She orchestrated everything. Laura Harrison was the architect of one of the most destructive drug enterprises this city has ever seen. Laura's defense team faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was clear: to humanize her. They argued that she had been driven to crime by desperation, a widowed mother with no other options. They highlighted her love for her sons, emphasizing how every choice she made was for their survival. "She's not a villain," her attorney said during closing arguments. "She's a mother who was pushed to the edge. Yes, she made mistakes, grave mistakes, but they were born from necessity, not malice." The defense called several character witnesses, including neighbors who spoke of Laura's kindness before her descent into the criminal world. But these testimonies were a faint echo against the overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Laura herself refused to take the stand. She sat silently throughout the trial, her face a mask of calm, even as the prosecution dismantled her life piece by piece. To the jury, this silence spoke volumes. It wasn't remorse they saw but the unyielding determination of a woman who had accepted her fate. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The charges were extensive: drug trafficking, racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy, and accessory to multiple acts of violence. Each conviction carried a heavy sentence, and when the judge addressed Laura, his tone was stern, almost sorrowful. "Mrs. Harrison," he began, "your actions have caused immeasurable harm to this community. You built an empire on the suffering of others and turned your back on the very values you claimed to protect. It is the judgment of this court that you serve life in prison without the possibility of parole." As the sentence was read, Laura's face remained expressionless, but her hands clenched briefly in her lap. For a moment, the courtroom seemed frozen in time. Then the sound of sobbing broke the silence. A woman in the gallery, one of the mothers whose child had died from drugs supplied by Laura's network. The fallout from Laura's trial rippled through Detroit. The public outrage was not only directed at her but also at the corrupt officials exposed during the investigation. William "Bill" Carter, the city councilman who had protected Laura in exchange for bribes, resigned in disgrace and faced his own criminal charges. Richard "Rick" Baxter, her money launderer, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The police department faced a public reckoning over Officer Carter's betrayal and the department's complicity in enabling Laura's rise. But despite these consequences, the scars Laura left on the city remained. Families mourned lost loved ones, and Detroit grappled with the legacy of violence and corruption her empire had left behind. As Laura was led out of the courtroom, the reporters swarmed, their cameras capturing every step of her departure. For a moment, she paused on the courthouse steps, her eyes meeting the lenses pointed at her. There was no fear, no regret, only a quiet defiance. In that moment, she was no longer the Queen of Detroit. She was a mother who had lost everything. Her empire was gone, her sons were dead, and her freedom was a memory. Yet she had taken her revenge, and in her mind, that was enough. When the guards escorted her into the waiting van, the city exhaled. The reign of Laura Harrison had ended, but the shadow of her choices would linger in Detroit for years to come. Laura's trial was more than the conclusion of her story, it was a cautionary tale. The courtroom proceedings had exposed not just her crimes but the systemic failures that had allowed her rise. The newspapers dubbed her the Widow Kingpin, and her story became a symbol of how desperation, ambition, and vengeance could consume even the most ordinary lives. In her prison cell, Laura finally allowed herself to grieve, not for her lost empire, but for Michael and Kevin. She had built everything for them, only to lose them in the process. As she stared at the cold, gray walls, she knew she would carry the weight of their deaths for the rest of her life. The Queen of Detroit was gone, but her legacy, of power, of destruction, and of loss, was just beginning to haunt the city she had ruled. The prison walls were cold, unyielding, and silent, a far cry from the vibrant chaos of the empire Laura Harrison had once ruled. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, as the Queen of Detroit faded into memory. Inmates called her the Queen, some with reverence, others with mockery. But Laura no longer cared about titles or respect. Her world had ended long before the gavel struck in the courtroom. Laura spent most of her days in solitude, her once sharp mind now a battlefield of memories. The faces of Michael and Kevin haunted her, their laughter echoing in the quiet of her cell. She saw them as children, running through the yard on Maple Drive, their cheeks flushed with joy. Then, the memories twisted, Kevin's defiant smirk as he stood up for her, Michael's anguished plea for her to stop. And finally, their lifeless eyes staring at her from that cursed box. The grief was suffocating, but it was the guilt that consumed her. She had built her empire to protect her sons, to give them a life free from want or fear. Instead, she had dragged them into a world of violence and corruption, a world that had destroyed them. For all her power, for all her careful planning, Laura had failed at the one thing that mattered most, being a mother. Outside the prison walls, Detroit struggled to heal. The Iron Vultures, though weakened by Laura's revenge, quickly moved to reclaim the territories she had abandoned. The violence escalated, leaving the city to pick up the pieces of a war that had spilled into its streets. The corruption exposed during Laura's trial sparked reforms, but trust in the system had been irrevocably shaken. For those who had known Laura personally, the story was more complex. Some saw her as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had been pushed to her limits and forced to make impossible choices. Others viewed her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the seductive pull of power. Her story became the subject of podcasts, documentaries, and late-night discussions in smoke-filled bars. People debated her motives, her methods, and her legacy. Was she a villain? A tragic hero? Or something in between? On a gray afternoon in January 2019, Laura sat by the narrow window in her cell, the weak winter light casting long shadows across the floor. She held a photograph in her hands, faded and worn, the edges curling from years of handling. It was the last picture of her family, taken on a summer day long before the darkness descended. Her fingers traced the faces of her sons, lingering on their smiles. "I did this for you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant it as an explanation or an apology. But deep down, Laura knew the truth. She had chosen the path of power not just for them, but for herself. The control, the respect, the ability to command fear, it had been intoxicating. And it had come at the highest price imaginable. As Laura stared out at the bleak horizon, she found herself wondering how the world would remember her. Would she be the grieving widow who had been forced to make impossible choices? The ruthless queen-pin who had ruled Detroit with an iron fist? Or the broken mother who had lost everything in her pursuit of vengeance? The answer, she realized, didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that her sons were gone, and nothing, not the empire she had built, not the revenge she had taken, could ever bring them back. The Queen of Detroit was a ghost now, her reign reduced to stories told in whispers. But for Laura, the punishment wasn't the prison walls or the life sentence. Her punishment was living every day with the memories of what she had lost, and what she had done. What do you think of Laura Harrison's story? Was she a victim of circumstance, or did her ambition lead her to ruin? Could she have made different choices, or was she doomed from the start? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this tale of power, tragedy, and redemption resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the shadows lurking in the human soul. What story should we dive into next? Tell us, we're listening.